this war from day one was majority unpopular. But the one group that was holding on was self-described MAGA Republicans. Recently, I just saw a story in New York Magazine that showed that, of course, that number, even that group, has soured on the war. In May, about half of them said it was worth the candle, economically speaking. Now they're saying only about a third of that group thinks the war has been worth it economically.
Now, Donald Trump has announced he will be holding even more talks with Iran today after saying he cancelled plans for a massive strike on the country at the request of Gulf allies. The president added the US and Iran have reached a deal on the Strait of Hormuz ahead of the negotiations and are close to an agreement on denuclearization. Now, we have heard this once or twice before as the war drags on. So what's different this time? And will the US public continue to put up with it? Speaking to us now from New York is Sohrab Ahmari, the Iranian-American journalist and US editor of UnHerd. Sohrab, thanks very much for joining us. I feel like this is a little bit of history repeating. Is there anything different this time? Is this a ploy to try and lower oil prices?
Honestly, Seb, I'm with you. Actually, by some counts, this is the 40th, maybe 40 plus iteration of this dynamic in which the president threatens a massive strike on Iran, wiping Persian civilization off the face of the earth, so on and so forth. And then just before he pulls back and then completely changes his tune and says the new Iranian leadership is great. They're really responsible, and we're just steps away from a deal, and it'll be wrapped up soon. So I don't know. Like, there are signals. The Iranians said that that there's no direct negotiation, but that's just their way of saying, characterizing these talks, because they always go through mediators. So it's a way for them to deny that there are negotiations when there may be a process underway. But I just don't see kind of what larger deal could emerge from this that would allow President Trump to save face, which is what all he wants to do, is to now just to be able to save face and say that he restored the status quo ante in the Strait of Hormuz, which is, of course, the biggest thing that Iran is reluctant to do. And so, like you, I'm fairly kind of skeptical. I think it feels like a rerun of something we've seen many times before.
And the problem is, Sohrab, is that if we were going back to February this year, there's an awful lot of people who would say they would settle for the status quo of just going back to that era. But any sense of a deal feels like it's not going to be that. There's going to have to be some kind of money paid to Iran, which is, of course, a despotic, radical regime. And that just feels very hard to cast as a win, even for the US president, who's very good at taking, some kind of wins from even a massive loss.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This is why lots of people warned against this war before it actually became inevitable or unfolded. And here we are now. Look, I think what I predict, and I'll eat my shoe on your show later if I'm wrong, but I think there won't be any kind of a grand deal between the U.S. and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz or even any of the other things, but there will be some arrangement reached whereby oil traffic and natural gas traffic can resume to something like its former state through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iranians will get the money they want, which they frame as reparations, not from the U.S., but from some arrangement with the Gulf states, investing in Iran, or what have you, calling it environmental fees as they did at one point. Because look, what is the nature of these Arab regimes? I'm going to sound like Hannibal Lecter here, of each thing ask what is its nature. The Arab regimes, their nature is they pay off problems. They love to pay off problems. And so if they can just reach a point where they can have some deal with the Iranians where investment is easier, and of course the Iranians have to signal that they're prepared to make investment easier, then we'll reach some sort of uneasy truce without any kind of grand deal. Now, I, thought there was going to be a grand deal out of the Switzerland talks. I traveled with the vice president as a credentialed reporter and interviewed him aboard Air Force Two when he was coming back. I think politically for the GOP and especially for Vice President Vance, the designated heir to MAGA, it would be better if there were some deal such that he could say, look, I brought the peace. Whatever you think of the war, I won the peace. But I think the Iranians aren't going to give us that, unfortunately.
And how's all this going down, both in the wider American public, Sohrab, but also with the MAGA base? Because internationally, I think there's very few people who would say that this was a good idea. And it also flew in the face for a lot of what was said about America first and no more foreign interventions. But a lot of the MAGA base is very loyal to Donald Trump. So I'd love your sense on what they think of it and what the wider country thinks about it. Or is it all just seen through the economic lens and what it means on the forecourt?
Look, in the wider country, the war was never popular. From day one, it was unpopular when it comes to the general electorate in a way that was unprecedented. You didn't see that in 2003 with the Iraq War. You didn't see that with Vietnam. In this case, this war from day one was majority unpopular. But the one group that was holding on was self-described MAGA Republicans. The Senate Republicans at one point put out a tweet saying 95% support this war, and there was this little asterisk in the tweet. And if you looked much closer and much smaller font, it said asterisk 95% of MAGA Republicans. So that's the share of the population, maybe 25%, maybe 30% of the population who would support President Trump if tomorrow he converted to Shiite Islam. And as part of making a peace deal, they would say, "Oh, well, that's Trump for you. He's really smart." So that's that. They were supporting it. However, more recently, I just saw a story in New York Magazine that showed that, of course, that number, even that group, has soured on the war. In May, about half of them said it was worth the candle, economically speaking. Now they're saying only about a third of that group thinks the war has been worth it economically. Because, look, Americans are like people everywhere. They look at gas prices. They look at the cost of living, which obviously a war that raises energy costs has inflationary pressures across sectors, across the economy. And so that's being felt with, as we just discussed earlier in this conversation, no clear gains. So even kind of self-described MAGA Republicans, who are the hardest of the hardcore, are turning against it. What's scary for Republicans is the Trump coalition in 2024 was not just MAGA Republicans. MAGA Republicans only a part of the larger Trump coalition. You also had working class Obama to Trump voters. These were people who twice voted for Obama and then switched to Trump. You also had half of Hispanic men, a fifth of African American men. These people are not MAGA worshipers. They're not Trump worshipers. They think of Trump in a conditional way. Look, you said you were going to do this and that, and we supported you on that basis. Now you're doing something else. We're getting off the train, and that's really scary for Republicans.
And just finally, so one of the big stories that's been kicking off in the UK is about the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino. Now, the English Football Association is going to drop support for the FIFA president after Wales also withdrew its backing. And we know that President Trump and Mr. Infantino are very close. If he is fired or pushed out, how do you think the White House will respond?
I mean, Trump is generally loyal to people who are loyal to him up to a point. But I think what Trump can say is, under my watch, we had a very successful World Cup. Now, I know some people will disagree with that, especially when it came to refereeing Argentina games. I myself was pulling my hair out at the England-Argentina game. I thought that
Weren't we all?
But at the end of the day, he from Trump's point of view, he delivered his big happy World Cup. There was this impression of lots of foreigners coming to us and seeing the abundance that we have in this society, and just a different, wholesome, welcoming side of America that cuts against its global perception. And that was a success. So beyond that point, does Trump really care that much about the future of FIFA? I don't think so. He's not going to stake more than zero political capital on that.
Well, that was Sohrab Ahmari, US editor of UnHerd.